Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Finstep Asia Edge podcast. I'm back in Dubai as on the sidelines of the Dubai FinTech Summit, but with a special person who was responsible to bring me to Dubai all this a couple of years back, this Deepa Raja Carbon, who is the Vice Chairperson and Managing Director of the Virtual Assets Regulatory Authority of Dubai, Vara for short, and have been doing wonderful work in building regulations and an ecosystem for virtual assets in Dubai and the UAE as a whole. Thank you so much for taking out time, Deepa, and joining us for this podcast. It's truly an honor to have you, not only because we work together, but because of what's being built in the city and with Vara leading the way in Asia and globally with regards to the regulatory framework. So thank you for joining us.
Firstly, thank you very much for having me on your show and your podcast here, Mushir. What I will say to your audience is I think a lot of people in Hong Kong are very glad to have you back, and we were very glad to have you here. So I was actually told just during this last week by quite a few people, hey, don't steal our people. Right? So I think that says a lot about you. So well done to you for having trusted us enough to come and experience the environment with us, but also for going back and spreading the word. Much appreciated.
Thank you. I think it was a wonderful experience being here for the 1.5 years, learning about how the city functions, but also being able to work collaboratively with the ecosystem. And I think that's one of the, I want to start off with that question, which is about the evolution of Vara from the, the law in 2022 to the setup and regulation as part of the broader vision that Sheikh Mohammed has for the city. I typically say impossible is nothing is the tagline for Dubai, and would love your views on how Vara evolved, how it came about, and what is the vision behind Vara.
Yeah. So you are very right in pointing out that the DNA of the city is very much about what is a goalpost and a vision, and making sure the obstacles along the way get resolved, right? The challenges are bound to be, but if you do not set yourself a challenging target, you're never going to be able to exceed and fulfill for your economy what you owe to the people, right? So very much about imagine what is impossible and then try to beat that, right? And in that context, coming out of COVID, which I think a lot of people probably already know, Dubai and the UAE were about the first economy to reopen in a post-COVID environment, right? Back in 2019, early parts of 2020, if you will, mid of 2020, we were open already. And open to tourism at that time and to events shortly after that, right? We hosted the Expo bang on, immediately after in 2021. It was postponed by a year. But at that time, I think the world also clearly recognized that it is possible to safely reopen an economy without compromising on the health of its citizens, which is obviously the first and foremost priority, right?
Correct.
But equally, ensuring that people that come into our market do not take back risk to their markets, right? That was at a human level, of course, but this was then to think about the economy broadly and say, we have been traditionally an economy for a flow-through market, right? So whether it's logistics, it's transport, it's trade, and that has been Dubai's proposition to the rest of the world. So how do we think about financial services in that context? And how do we think about the new economy in that context? Of course, building what we've already got, but if you look at Web3, blockchain, metaverse, and AI, the underlying ecosystem there is largely enabled by a lot of blockchain-related technology and crypto, crypto virtual assets is a very important part of it. Then we were sort of construed to think about what does the rest of the world have in this context of the last decade or two, perhaps even 15 years or so, that the industry has been in existence, the crypto world, and what do the other jurisdictions have that we can potentially replicate and build on. Right. And very quickly came to the realization that there isn't really a very specialist regime designed for virtual assets.
Correct.
And that's really where the idea of Vara came up, and we were set up in the February of 2022. And that's how we came into being.
And so, we have the story, as you mentioned, which is no specific virtual assets regulatory authority globally. And the approach that Dubai has taken in terms of being an enabler, right, and being in the forefront of that. So what was the approach to building the regulations, right? At the initial stages, industry consultations, and there's a lot of other things, elements. So what has been Vara's main focus and approach towards building the regulations?
So that's a terrific question, right? And I say this out of a lot of respect and humility in the context of, if you look at global regulations, which is where all of us come in from, there's so much fantastic work that actually has been done, right? Not only in the world of FS, but also in the world of tech, and where the two converge. And where it seemed to be a little sort of, if you will, a learning ground for us, was to say, is the best approach to look at what has been done and evolve it, or is the best approach to reinvent from scratch just because another regulator doesn't exist? And we chose to do the former, right? We said, let's look and benchmark, because there's such great work that has been done. We are here to learn from the journey that other regulators have gone through, and sort of said, look, we're not able to resolve this, and perhaps work with them to see what can we construct and construe in our environment that we may be able to get to market a little bit faster, and use us, Dubai, if you will, as the sandbox for the rest of the world, right? So that, if you will, was the construct. That was the principle of how we went about this. And the second thing, and as you've been working with us, you're very familiar with this. We are a principles-based regulator, not too dissimilar from MICA, right? And there are other regulators that do the same as well. Our regulations are not product-based. They're not specific to the kind of product you create. And the reason we chose to do this, it's more activity-based, right? The reason we chose to do it is the product and the technology is always going to evolve significantly faster than a regulation around it, right? Do you want to create a set of rules that is product-confined and therefore technology restrictive in a certain sense, right? Even if you don't intend for it to be, it's going to end up being as such. Would you rather be about the activity that is being conducted and the people that are being serviced? Because that is your job as a regulator, your responsibility as a regulator, to protect the lives of the community that is engaged with that industry, right? And so we're a very activity-based regulator, and that's sort of how our regulations have been set up, as is evident in the several rule books that you see. But the second part of it is, you can either create regulations and say, I'm never going to change my mind about it, or you can say, I understand that this industry is evolving, the market's evolving, and as they are learning, I want to learn with them. I come to the table in that sense humble, right? I come to the table with an open ear and an open attitude to saying, as you grow, allow me to grow with you, right? If you have a point of view that we may not have considered, let us discuss it so that we can then test it, perhaps in smaller proportions. I don't want to call it a sandbox, but we had an MVP program, a minimum viable product. That way I get to see your behavior. You get to demonstrate how effective you are at thinking about self-regulation, at thinking about responsibility. And if you are great at what you do anyway, then our job is to provide you the guardrails and not to micromanage you. Right. And that's sort of, if you will, the principle of how Vara has been organized.
It would be nice to understand how you see it as that, that living regs. I'm using that term loosely in terms of how that will evolve as we more stabilize in the business models.
Right. So, when the industry or the market hears the word living regs, the foremost concern is, oh my God, I'm signing up to a set of rules, and tomorrow those rules are going to change on me, right? And so I do want to caveat, it's a fantastic terminology, but people interpret it the way they want to, depending on the condition that is being imposed on them, right? But yes, we are a living regulation, and we are living in the context of saying the base plate doesn't change. The foundations don't change. The anchor points don't change. We are there for, of course, AML, KYC, coordination with FATF, compliance on all of those strands, cross-border risk in an absolute no-no. We cannot be the ones originating a risk that then gets transported to the rest of the world.
Yeah, and as you were saying, this is very pertinent. I was reflecting on the concept of responsible innovation, and that links up to how can we enable people, give them access and ability to function in a normalish way, while protecting others and who are partners and whom you work with. And same way, with the Vara regulations, which is responsible innovation.
I completely see your point. Like, you're able to respond in a not desirable condition for a market, and you're able to respond proactively, responsibly, and in a very high risk space. Equally, can you translate that behavior when you look at it from a lens of enablement, in the lens of progression, in the lens of forward thinking, and something that's very desirable?
Yes,
right?
exactly. That's what
so,
I mean. Yeah.
How do you take a risk and actually change it into a reward? And this is kind of where we're at.
Yeah, I think that's what I found about Dubai's DNA, right? What excited me about, and still does, is this element of not looking at something as a problem, but looking at how can we enable something.
Correct.
And that's why I was giving the example, which is had a big impact at the time when everybody's struggling, forgetting. And so in a similar way, you can have a lot of positive things which may not be growing necessarily. And then Dubai, and AI is another element that Dubai is working on very, very well.
These are two very, very important points you make, right? Yeah. Knowing that there is an issue, there is a constraint, there is a challenge that is a global challenge.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
It is for people around the world, and if there is something we can do to prove, almost serve as a test bed, and prove that it can be resolved in an effective fashion.
Yeah.
And therefore, and in this context, it's an important one, the risks that are being generated can be mitigated, can be managed. But until you accept the risk and work with that product and the set of activities around the product, you don't understand the risk.
Correct.
As effectively as you could.
Yes.
So prohibition is never the solution for remediation. Remediation comes from acceptance.
Correct.
And I do think that that's a principle that's very much core to the DNA of the city. Right.
And building on that, as we go towards we had the foundation, we now have people coming into Dubai, coming into the region, and the regs have been out for over a year now, the full market regs, and we've had licenses issued. What do you see as the next phase of both the regulations, but also from a market perspective?
Yeah.
What are you seeing in the market, and how do you see Vara looking and treating that?
So I want to answer that from a Dubai UAE market as well as a global market perspective.
Please,
for the world of virtual assets, right?
Yeah.
So Vara's establishment of the rules and sort of the facilitation of a relatively secure environment for virtual assets, I think has had a largely sort of conducive impact, both on the industry, of course, and their responsibility, but also on fellow regulators, which I think I'm slightly happier about, right? You, of course, see across the world more regulators understanding and seeing that, hey, this is possible without it being a very big risk. MICA was already up there doing it. The FCA was, HKMA and the SFCB has been. So, and of course, MAS has been for a while. Australian regulators have been too. So several regulators have been doing really good work in this environment for many years, right?
Sure.
For well over a decade. And I do think that having a test bed that actually works, almost a proof of concept, allows them to also have the ability to convince their own ecosystems that this is doable, and there isn't as much a risk as you may have conceived it to be, insofar as it can be managed.
Correct. Yeah.
So one part of that dialogue is very much a bilateral dialogue. It's very much a conversation with fellow regulators to say how many of these rules are almost exchangeable, interoperable, and acceptable in a way in which you can expect them to be the risks are minimized, right? The risks are minimized, and the acceptance of the risk is more tolerable. A general level of acceptance is established at a global level, right? So that's part one.
Fair.
The second part of that equation is the industry becoming more responsible. The industry has become a lot more conscious about the risks that they're permeating, and a few bad characters should not necessarily, irresponsible characters, I don't mean bad in the other sense, irresponsible characters should not deter from the fact that the majority of the industry is actually quite responsible, wants to be responsible, they just don't know how to, right? And they want to have that that conversation much more progressively. And I say crypto loosely, but I mean virtual assets is here to stay.
And we've seen that in the broader traditional finance ecosystem with some of the large.
And you see that actually, great point, right? You see that most of the conversations we're having today are not native crypto.
Yeah.
Most of the conversations we're having today are TradFi. TradFi participants that want to be in the DeFi space, which I think is brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant.
Yeah. Now, you touched upon this, and I just want to build a little bit more with regards to cross-border nature and collaboration.
Yeah.
The UAE in general has been very collaborative, has done a lot of work with the central bank doing with Hong Kong MA over the last few years, and the governments have also been very proactive in building partnerships and business bridges. I wanted to get a perspective from the Hong Kong, Greater China perspective and connecting with Dubai and UAE, how you see that evolve, and Vara's been very approachable for Hong Kong businesses as well as delegations as they come in. So what can they expect, and how could this build further in terms of a partnership in the coming years?
Look, you make a tremendous point, right? The UAE and Dubai have tremendous bilateral relationships, one of the most connected in that sense, and from a political standpoint, right? Are both in terms of the nationalities we host as a city, more than 200 nationalities, right? Is one of the most, really a microcosm for the world in many ways, right? Not just because we welcome people, but we also welcome governments, and our relationships with conducting business in those markets has been tremendous. We've got our Dubai Economy and Tourism, which is the entity that is responsible for a lot of these conversations to happen. You have seen towards the last quarter of last year, we had some great engagement with Hong Kong, particularly bilaterals that were signed with the jurisdiction, as with a lot of the Asian markets, right? And our relationship with the Chinese, the mainland Chinese, as well as the Hong Kong regulators has been phenomenal. Progressive in the sense that a lot of data sharing, a lot of openness, and saying not only can our companies have access to both our markets, because naturally we get exposure to different things, but how can our rules be sort of interoperable in some sense? How can the regime be acceptable, a level of equivalence that can be established, and the risk profiles, right? From both regulators' perspective, do we consider our risk profiles palatable to the other? And that's really the kind of convergence of minds that you would expect to formulate with any other regulator. So, of course, for Hong Kong businesses and for mainland Chinese businesses, the door is always welcome. For all of Dubai, and of course Vara in particular, the technology and the innovation and the spirit of progress that you guys have demonstrated, phenomenal. I mean, honestly. And this has been, the industry has been housed in your ecosystem for the longest time. So I hear a lot of complaints actually from your fellow regulators, don't steal our people. And I have to say, we do that with the kindest heart to say they're all coming back to you with a lot more business from our end.
Yeah, I think that business is only going to grow in terms of collaboration, and it's a partnership, and it's in setting up in both places. And to that effect, there are a lot of businesses I talked to in Hong Kong when I've gone back, and otherwise as well, who are keen in exploring Dubai as a market and to get licensed with Vara. What would be some of the things you want them to keep in mind as they come towards applying for licenses with Vara?
When they come, I mean, no different from you would with any other regulator, right? Our rules and regulations are fairly comprehensive. Look, that you're coming here, as I mentioned right up in the beginning, not to become the jurisdiction of least resort. You're coming here because you're regulated by a jurisdiction that the rest of the world finds as a convergence point.
Correct.
So that you're able to operate and sort of communicate and access audiences from the rest of the world that you may geographically find slightly difficult from being in a Far Eastern jurisdiction, right? Already within our space, you've got direct access to Africa, to the Indian subcontinent, to the Middle East, of course. But then there is Europe, and the Americas are not too far away, right? So how do you make something serve as your global hub and perhaps supplement the activity that you're already facilitating out of your mainland Chinese operations / your Hong Kong operations, which may be more dedicated and specific to Asia, right? So that's number one. And number two would be, once you familiarize yourself with our regulations, the regulations are largely TradFi based, but very definitely with a customization to DeFi. So it's not just a build on what already exists. It is fairly comprehensive in its nature, but there are always going to be things that you may want to do that may not necessarily be covered, or you may not be sure how to interpret that in your coverage, right?
Yeah, so it's been a wonderful experience in seeing that growth, of seeing that collaborative openness approach, and deep for having been in that system from within to showcasing why and where we head in the future for virtual assets.
Well, I would say to your audience, if you aren't familiar, definitely speak to Mashir. He's very, very familiar with the environment and has been such a great contributor to our establishment and to our success. So thank you for being part of the environment, and thank you to your people as well. Right?
Thank you very much.
They're more than welcome.
Thank you very much. A pleasure.
Take care.
Audience, please stay tuned to our social media and follow us on Spotify, Apple, and YouTube to listen to more interesting conversations and have special guests like Deepa on. Thank you very much.